There are moments in life that never announce themselves. They don't arrive with dramatic music or unforgettable conversations. They don't ask you to stop what you're doing or warn you that something inside you is about to change. They simply appear quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time you recognize them, they've already become part of who you are. I've always believed that people overestimate the importance of major events. They think transformation begins with a life-changing decision, a painful goodbye, or a single unforgettable day. But that's rarely how it happens. Real change is quieter than that. It begins with small observations that refuse to disappear. A sentence that stays with you longer than it should. A question you can't answer no matter how many times you revisit it. A silence that somehow speaks louder than every conversation you've had before. At first, those moments seem insignificant. You move forward. You continue your routine. You tell yourself you're exactly the same person you were yesterday. But somewhere beneath your awareness, something has already shifted. The strange thing about the mind is that it doesn't always reveal change immediately. Sometimes it waits. It collects experiences without explaining why they're important. It stores details you don't remember choosing to keep. Then, one ordinary day, it places all of them in front of you at once. Suddenly, the pieces fit together, not because the world changed, because you did. I've spent years believing that understanding came from finding better answers. If I read enough, observed enough, questioned enough, eventually everything would make sense. I thought certainty was something you earned through effort. Now, I'm not so sure. The more carefully I observe life, the more I realize that certainty is surprisingly rare. Most of us are walking through the world carrying stories we've never examined. We repeat routines we've inherited. We defend beliefs we've never questioned. We chase goals that were handed to us long before we decided whether they actually belonged to us. It's comfortable that way, predictable, safe, because questioning everything is exhausting. It's much easier to accept familiar explanations than to admit we don't truly know why we think the way we do. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it answered anything, because it changed the questions I was asking. Instead of wondering what people believed, I became curious about how those beliefs were built. Instead of focusing on what someone said, I started paying attention to what remained unsaid, the pauses, the hesitation, the tiny contradictions almost everyone overlooks. That's where the real story usually lives, not in the polished version people present to the world, but in the moments where certainty quietly disappears. I've noticed something else too. Most people spend their lives trying to become someone else, a better version, a stronger version, a more successful version. There's nothing wrong with improvement, but sometimes the greatest obstacle isn't who you are. It's everything you've accepted without realizing it. Think about that for a moment. How many opinions do you genuinely own? How many dreams began with you? How many fears were learned simply because everyone around you treated them as truth? These aren't easy questions. That's probably why we avoid them. Looking inward isn't difficult because we might dislike what we find. It's difficult because we might discover that much of what we considered permanent was never really ours. That idea used to unsettle me. Now it feels strangely freeing because if something was learned, it can also be unlearned. If a limitation was built, it can be rebuilt differently. If a story was inherited, it can be rewritten. None of that happens overnight. There isn't a single conversation that changes everything. There isn't one realization that suddenly makes life simple. Growth isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. It's choosing awareness again and again, even when comfort would be easier. Most people never notice this process because they're waiting for a breakthrough. They imagine transformation as a single, extraordinary moment. But real transformation often looks ordinary while it's happening. A different thought, a calmer reaction, a choice that feels almost insignificant. Days later, nothing seems different. Months later, you're living a life that would have felt impossible to your former self. The strange part is that no one else notices the transition. From the outside, you're still the same person. You speak the same language. You wear the same clothes. You laugh at familiar jokes. Yet internally, the landscape has changed. Priorities rearrange themselves. Old fears lose their authority. Conversations that once felt meaningful begin to sound strangely empty. Not because you've become better than anyone else, because you've become more honest with yourself. And honesty has a way of quietly separating what matters from what never did. I've come to believe that awareness is less like opening a door and more like adjusting your vision. The world doesn't suddenly become different. You simply begin noticing what was always there: parts, habits, cocaines, possibilities. They existed long before you recognized them. Recognition doesn't create reality, it reveals it. Maybe that's why genuine insight feels so unsettling. It doesn't add something new, it removes something false. And once illusion disappears, it's remarkably difficult to put it back. You can't unknow what you've truly understood. You can't return to seeing the world exactly as you did before. That's both the gift and the cost of paying attention. Because awareness asks something from you. Once you see clearly, responsibility quietly follows. You can no longer pretend you didn't notice. You can no longer blame circumstances for every choice. You begin realizing that every small decision shapes the person you're becoming. Not tomorrow, today, right now, and perhaps that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. We become ourselves long before we realize it's happening. Every habit, every conversation, every unnoticed decision leaves a mark, not dramatic enough to feel important, just consistent enough to slowly redefine us, which means the person you'll be a year from now isn't created by one extraordinary day. They're being created in moments that seem completely ordinary, including this one. Maybe that's why you're still listening. Not because you've found all the answers, but because some part of you recognizes the questions. And sometimes that's where every meaningful journey truly begins. The longer I paid attention, the more I realized that life isn't measured by the events we remember. It's measured by the moments that quietly reshape the way we see everything else. Most of those moments don't look important at first. They're almost forgettable. A conversation that lasts only a few minutes, a book opened at exactly the right page, a stranger saying something they probably won't remember 5 minutes later. Even sitting alone in complete silence can become one of those moments if you're willing to hear what your own mind has been trying to tell you. We spend so much of our lives searching for louder answers that we overlook the quieter ones. Maybe that's because loud things are easier to recognize. They demand attention. They insist on being noticed. But truth rarely behaves that way. It waits patiently. It doesn't compete with distractions. It doesn't force its way into your thoughts. It simply remains where it has always been until you're finally ready to see it. I've started wondering how many opportunities I've walked past simply because I expected them to look extraordinary. How many lessons disguised themselves as ordinary days? How many turning points were hidden inside routines I barely noticed? It's a strange feeling when you realize that your future isn't built only by the decisions you remember making. Sometimes it's built by the tiny choices you never considered important enough to think about twice. Choosing to listen instead of interrupting. Choosing curiosity instead of certainty. Choosing to pause before reacting. None of those choices feel dramatic, yet over time, they quietly redefine your character. And character, more than circumstance, determines the direction of a life. That's something I didn't understand for a long time. I believed circumstances created people. Now, I think people often create meaning from whatever circumstances they find themselves in. Two individuals can experience the same situation and leave with completely different stories. One sees proof that the world is unfair. The other discovers resilience they never knew they possessed. The event remains the same, the interpretation changes everything. That realization made me look differently at my own memories. Instead of asking what happened, I began asking why certain moments stayed with me while others disappeared. Memory isn't a perfect recording. It's a reflection of significance. The mind keeps what it believes matters. Sometimes it protects us by forgetting details. Other times it preserves a single sentence for years because somehow it contains a lesson we haven't fully understood yet. Maybe that's why we occasionally find ourselves thinking about something from years ago without knowing why it suddenly returned. Perhaps our minds aren't revisiting the past. Perhaps they're reminding us that we're finally capable of understanding something we couldn't before. Growth changes old memories, not because the past itself changes, because we do. A lesson ignored at 18 may become obvious at 30. Advice that once sounded ordinary can suddenly feel profound after enough experience. It's almost as though life teaches the same lesson repeatedly until we become the kind of person who can finally recognize it. That thought comforts me. It means being confused isn't failure. It's part of learning. Not every answer is supposed to arrive immediately. Some require patience, some require experience, and some require becoming someone different before they make any sense at all. Maybe that's why wisdom is so difficult to describe. It isn't just knowledge. It's knowledge that has been tested by time. Anyone can repeat meaningful words. Living them is something entirely different. I've met people who could explain confidence perfectly, but doubted themselves every day. I've met people who spoke endlessly about kindness while overlooking those closest to them. And I've met quiet individuals who never claimed to have answers, yet somehow made everyone around them feel understood. That's when I realized that authenticity isn't measured by what someone says, it's revealed by the consistency between their words and their actions. That consistency is surprisingly rare, perhaps because it's difficult. It's much easier to describe the person we hope to become than to patiently become that person. One decision at a time, real change asks for repetition, not inspiration. Inspiration fades, discipline remains, motivation comes and goes, values stay when emotions change. I've learned not to trust every feeling that visits my mind. Feelings are important. They deserve attention. But they aren't always accurate. Sometimes they're echoes of old fears. Sometimes they're reactions to temporary circumstances. Sometimes they're simply reminders that being human means experiencing uncertainty. Learning the difference takes time. It requires slowing down long enough to ask difficult questions without demanding immediate answers. I've found that the strongest people I know aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who refuse to let struggle define the limits of who they can become. There's quiet strength in continuing when no one is watching, in choosing integrity when shortcuts are available, in remaining patient when progress feels invisible. Those moments rarely receive applause, yet they're often the moments that matter most, because character is built privately long before it's recognized publicly. We admire visible success without seeing the invisible habits that made it possible. We celebrate outcomes while overlooking the countless ordinary days that created them. Maybe that's why comparison is so misleading. We're usually comparing someone else's visible results with our own hidden process. No comparison can ever be fair under those conditions. Everyone is carrying challenges we cannot see. Everyone is learning lessons we know nothing about. Remembering that changes the way you move through the world. It makes judgment a little quieter, compassion a little easier, and gratitude a little more natural. The more I understand this, the less interested I become in proving anything. Not because ambition disappears, because peace becomes more valuable than constant validation. There comes a point where being understood by everyone stops feeling necessary. What matters instead is understanding yourself honestly enough that you don't need every opinion to confirm your direction. That kind of confidence isn't loud. It doesn't need attention. It simply continues forward, even when no one notices. Perhaps that's the quietest form of strength, not certainty, not perfection, but the willingness to keep growing while accepting that growth never truly ends. There's always another perspective to consider, another habit to improve, another assumption to question. And maybe that's exactly how it should be, because the moment we believe we've learned everything is often the moment we stop learning at all. Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing that life rewards the people who always have the right answers. Instead, I began noticing something far more interesting. It seems to reward the people who are willing to keep asking better questions. There's a difference. An answer can make you feel certain. A question can make you grow. And growth has never been comfortable. It asks you to leave behind ideas that once felt permanent. It asks you to admit that yesterday's confidence may become tomorrow's misunderstanding. For a long time, I thought changing my mind meant I had been wrong. Now, I see it differently. Changing your mind often means you've learned something your past self couldn't have known. That's not weakness, that's progress. It's easy to admire certainty. It's much harder to admire humility. Yet humility is what allows us to keep learning long after others have decided they've seen enough. The world changes. People change. Experience changes us. If our understanding never changes with it, then we're no longer paying attention. I've realized that many of the limits we carry aren't placed there by reality. They're placed there by familiarity. We repeat the same routines because they're familiar. We avoid new possibilities because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Eventually, comfort becomes a habit, not because it's making life better, simply because it's predictable. Predictability has its place. It gives us stability. But it can also quietly convince us that growth has stopped being necessary. That's the danger, not failure. Failure usually teaches something. Stagnation teaches nothing. It simply repeats yesterday until years quietly disappear. I don't think anyone intends for that to happen. Most people don't wake up deciding to stop growing. It happens gradually. Small compromises, delayed dreams, conversations postponed until the right time, books left unread, ideas left unexplored, questions left unasked. None of them seem significant on their own, but together, they slowly shape the direction of a life. That's why I've become more careful with ordinary days. They're not ordinary at all. They're where our future quietly takes shape. The habits we repeat become the person we become, not overnight, not dramatically, paddedly, almost invisibly. I used to wait for motivation before beginning something difficult. Now I've learned that motivation often arrives after action, not before it. The first step creates the second. The second creates momentum. Momentum creates confidence. Confidence isn't usually the starting point. It's often the result of continuing long enough to see progress. That realization changed how I approached almost everything. Instead of asking whether I felt ready, I started asking whether the next step was possible. Most of the time, it was not easy. Possible, there's an important difference. Waiting until everything feels easy can become another way of waiting forever. Life doesn't ask us to know the entire path. It usually asks us to take the next honest step, again and again. Eventually, those small steps become a direction, then a habit, then a life. I've also noticed that people often underestimate the value of stillness. We're constantly encouraged to move faster, think faster, achieve faster, respond faster. But clarity doesn't always arrive at the speed we demand. Sometimes it appears only after we've stopped trying to force it. Some of my clearest thoughts have arrived during quiet walks, long drives, peaceful mornings before the rest of the world had fully awakened. Not because those moments contained answers, because they contained enough silence for answers to become audible. Noise isn't only sound. It can also be constant distraction, constant urgency, constant comparison. The mind needs moments without interruption, not to escape reality, to understand it more clearly. I've begun treating silence as something valuable rather than something empty. Within it, I notice details that would otherwise disappear, the rhythm of my own thinking, the assumptions I didn't realize I was making, the goals that truly matter beneath all the temporary distractions. Silence has a remarkable way of revealing priorities. When everything else becomes quiet, what's left often tells you what matters most. Of course, silence can also be uncomfortable. It removes excuses. It leaves us alone with ourselves. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. Not because self-reflection is always pleasant, because honesty rarely begins anywhere else. I've discovered that the conversations we avoid having with ourselves eventually become the obstacles we keep meeting in the outside world. Ignored fears don't disappear. Ignored doubts don't vanish. They simply wait, beep haughtily, until we're willing to face them. The encouraging part is that courage doesn't require the absence of fear. It only requires movement despite it. Every meaningful achievement I've witnessed has included uncertainty somewhere along the journey. No one sees the future with perfect clarity. We move forward anyway. That's what makes hope meaningful, not guaranteed outcomes. Meaningful effort. I've come to appreciate people who admit they don't know everything. There's something refreshing about intellectual honesty, about saying, "I'm still learning." Those three words may contain more wisdom than pretending to possess certainty that doesn't exist. Perhaps that's the lifelong task, not becoming someone who has every answer, becoming someone who never loses the desire to understand more deeply, someone who remains curious even after success, someone who remains grateful even after achievement, someone who remembers that every person they meet carries experiences capable of teaching something new. The world becomes richer when we approach it with that attitude, not because it changes, because our ability to notice it does. Maybe that's what growth has always been, not becoming someone entirely different, becoming more fully awake to the possibilities that have surrounded us all along. And perhaps tomorrow's version of you isn't waiting somewhere far in the future. Perhaps it's quietly being built by the choices you make today, the thoughts you choose to question, and the courage you show in taking one more step, even when you can't yet see where the path will lead.